Hi, I'm Scott. There's a lot of good content out there on how to make good habits, good healthy habits. But the problem is that there's so many ways to lose your good habits. So I want to talk about today keeping your good habits by identifying those habit killers or productivity killers. So I've got 5 of them. Let's get started. Number 1, schedule changes. When school starts or you start a new job or you go from working remote to working in the office, your schedule changes, and oftentimes habits are built on good quality schedules. You hear people talk about their morning routine and how important it is. But what happens when suddenly your morning routine is interrupted or changed? You literally have to get your feet back under you and start identifying those ways of keeping your good habits going. Number 2, changes in priority. When your priorities change, you have a mental shift. And when that happens, your habits are impacted. Your productivity is impacted also. But when you change from one thing to another, say that you're in the midst of a pandemic, suddenly your priority is to be safe. Well, whatever your habits were, if you went out for a morning run, suddenly do you wear a mask, do you not wear a mask? Your priorities have changed. And so then your habits and your good habits change also. And it can potentially, you could lose your good habits because suddenly your priority changed. Another example of a priority change is, say you're working on your bachelor's or your master's degree and suddenly you lose your job, or you get another job, or you have a change in jobs. Suddenly you have some on-the-job learning. Your priorities simply have changed in that situation. So any habits that you built into place regarding your education ultimately are impacted, and you got to fight like demon dogs to get your habits back under control. On a side note though, if you feel like you're at work and your priorities are changing every week, like every time you go into a project meeting, your priorities are changing, I don't think that your priorities are changing. I think what's happening is that your vision of what your priorities are may be a little too low. I work in a project management position and I hear the complaint quite often. Priorities change every week. Honestly, it's because the priorities are not the same. You're not in line with what the priorities of the company are. So if you feel like you're getting shifted back and forth and you get a lot of context switches between priorities, take some time, ask your boss, ask HR, ask whoever you need to ask. What is the vision of the company? Try to raise your vision of what's going on, and then you might actually see that those priorities aren't changing. It's just chaotic down in the trenches. And that brings us to number 3, which is context switching. When you're working on task A and you switch to task B, then you have a potential, that's what's called a context switch. So a good example of a context switch is, let's say you have a good healthy habit. At 11 a.m. you journal about your chaotic morning, and it helps you get centered back in place for a good productive afternoon. And you do this in a conference room, or you do this at the lunch table. Suddenly your regular spot for journaling changes. It's like you switched your context. Suddenly you're changing, you're journaling somewhere else. That change in location is like a context switch. And mentally, it can be hard to switch context or switch that location. Another kind of context switching is a mental context switch. So every time your phone rings or every time you get notified, something on your phone, you have to think about that. And so mentally, you change directions from what you're currently working on, to whatever that happened, whatever urgent thing took your attention from it. And you have this kind of an urgent versus important. So you have to be careful of context switches. They're just so subtle, but they can impact your habit. They can impact your productivity also. Number 4, not being intentional with your habits. I really do believe that good, healthy habits, they do not happen accidentally. Oftentimes, you may find yourself, it's convenient to journal at 11 a.m. It was an example that we used earlier. Or it's convenient to do gratitude journaling during your morning routine. But those things are not accidental. You're being very intentional to journal that way. And if you're not careful, if you're not intentionally continuing to your good habits, then you'll lose them. They don't happen accidentally, but you will lose them accidentally. So not being intentional about your habits is a good way to lose them. And the number 5 habit killer on my list involves habit stacking. I'm a big fan of stacking good habits on top of each other. So one habit triggers another habit. So in another video that I've talked about with gratitude journaling is that while you're brushing your teeth, you start thinking about gratitude journaling. and then you're more apt to gratitude journal. So that brushing your teeth is a good habit. Thinking about gratitude journaling is a great habit. Is a great habit. So you've stacked those. But when one good habit leads to another good habit, and the first good habit changes, then your second one is likely to be impacted also. So when it's like a house of cards, essentially, is that if you stack your habits, any one of those that changes, that causes a problem. So be warned that when you're stacking habits, it's awesome, but it only takes one of them to get out of whack, and suddenly you've lost your good habit of journaling. Quick recap. Number one, your schedule changes. It could be a way that you could lose a really good, healthy habit. Number two, your priorities change. Another way that you can lose a good, healthy habit. Number three, switching context, whether it be physically switching your context or mentally switching your context, could impact your habits and you could lose a good habit. Number four is not being intentional about your habits, because I believe that good habits don't happen accidentally, but you do lose them accidentally. And number five involves habit stacking. So when you have a good trigger habit that triggers you to do another good habit, it becomes a house of cards if you're not careful. So you got to watch out for that. Okay. If you like this video, please subscribe and click like. I really appreciate it. I do have a Facebook group and an Instagram account. The links are in the description. That's all I've got for now. Thanks. We'll see you next time. Change. That's not a good example. It's not a good example.